So without any further ado, we're going to get started, and I'm just going to let Jack introduce himself because he's really someone who requires no introduction whatsoever. So here is Giacomo DeStefano, director of the Paterson Museum.
Thank you very much, Heather. I appreciate it. And I appreciate everyone joining us today. The Wright's exhibit and Wright's Aeronautical is an important part of our history, and it's an important part of my history actually at the museum. When I first started working here back in 1985, we were in the beginning of the exhibit, the Wright years, 1920 to 1946, and we had quite a few people who were helping us. Most of them were all former employees, 30, 40-year men. And, I wish I had the knowledge I have today when they were here so I could talk to them again and get a little bit more insight and really understand what they were talking about. I got to be honest. People in my own neighborhood were from Wrights because I only lived right down the street when I grew up on Chestnut Street. And I knew it had to do with airplane engines, but the complexity of the works and how massive it was, again, it was over, and in and around Paterson was over 2.8 million square feet and about 20,000 employees at its height during the war years, which I mentioned in my last one. But it really had such impact, and unfortunately, all those guys are no longer there. So this is really a tribute to them. And what really has helped me out, I got to be honest, is the beauty of the internet. Hathitrust.org, archive.org, Library of Congress. They all have tons of information on there, and you can even get videos on some of these historic flights. So, there's a lot of information that you would have never been able to find at your fingertips. You would have taken months, if not years, with everything that can just, reach at the end of your fingertips. So let's start the little presentation we have. And this is going to be an overall view, looking at the engines and some of the famous flights that are directly connected to them. One or two people did notice that I used gold as the backdrop because it is the golden age of aviation. The golden age of aviation technically is between the wars, but I stretch it just a little bit longer. So let's look at Wright's activities and the manufacturing end things. Now, when the Wright Aeronautical Corporation formed, they were still based operations in New Brunswick, and most of their engines were based off the old Hispana Suiza, which they had been producing during World War I and under the moniker of Wright Martin. So it was just a natural progression that they would continue. You could see some of their early advertisement. It does indicate that they are based in New Brunswick. So they were still based here for several months before they're going to relocate to Paterson. And what I thought was interesting is one of the first Paterson ads is for this H model, as it would be. Again, it's based on Hispana Suiza, but Wrights had made so many improvements over the years that they really were becoming their own model. They were really quite removed, other than the aesthetics. It was a V8 and a V12 later. But of all planes to start would have been this Thomas Moore MB4, which this was like one of the most unsafe aircraft. It's actually push-pull. There's engines in the front and there's an engine in the back, or it would be the middle because it has like 3 fuselages. And this thing would torque and get all out of shape. I mean, they tested it for not even a year before the U.S. Mail just said, forget it. I mean, it was never really a practical piece. Yet the very first advertisement from the Paterson plant is showing this failed airplane. And, it's a bit of an irony there. Of course, you're familiar with the Paterson plant. It's built on Beckwith Avenue, which today is now a Lindbergh Place. And again, they did continue building the Hispana Suiza, but under their own version. This is the typical liquid-cooled engine, and by now they were calling it the Wright Model A. There was the A, the E, the H. There were a couple others, and again, they were quite independent from the old Hispana Suiza. But just a little back and forth. In 1940s, during the war effort, when we were using Spain to build some of our Wright's engines, they started calling them Hispana Suiza once again. But that's another story. Of course, we're in between the wars, so some of the very first engines are going to be used from the Army and Navy, and they're mainly for trainers. And many of the planes are built by our neighbor in Buffalo, Curtiss. It only seems natural that down the road, Curtiss Wright would, become that merger, since many of our engines ended up in their planes, although they were also building their own airplane engine. Just again, a couple of versions of the Model A and Model E. The slight variations, there's either going to be an E2 and E3, and these are normally based on cooling and different ways of piping water, becoming more efficient in oil transfer. but essentially the basic engine is the A and E. And one of the first manufacturers to really use this, and not too much historic, trips, would be the Travel Air company, Travel Air Model 3000 in particular. And you could get that with one or two engines, the Model A or the Model E. And you can see Model A was 150 horsepower, and the Model E generated 180, the stronger of the two. One person who was quite successful in using the this particular plane with our engine was Louis Thaden. At one time, she handled or held the women's altitude, endurance, and speed record. At least two of the three were done with this particular aircraft, but all three were done with Paterson engines. And you're going to hear a little bit more about her. But the idea of going 20,000 feet in an open air cockpit, quite impressive. Again, most of these feats talk about the wind in your hair. There's no oxygen up there. Model E2, again, just other improvements. I'm just getting these out of the way quickly because they're not the most important engines when you associate and think about, Wright's Aeronautical and your aviation. The one company, the Huff de Land company, what I like about them is they at least were offering two different models of the their aircraft, in the HO1, which you can see is a seaplane, and the HN1, which is air. For landing and field. Although almost every airplane that you'll see from time to time, they rework the landing gear, remove the wheels, and they'll throw pontoons on it. Some companies did make separate planes, but the fuselage, everything, it's all the same. One company that I ran across was Eberhard Steel Products. They're also in Buffalo, and they were really just making aviation parts. And then they received a contract to make the British SE, but instead of using the British engine, they used our own Wright's Model E. And then they had acquired about 50 or so French SPAD planes, the SPADs. And what they did is they got rid of the French engine. And again, they were remarketing them with our engines, the Model E. And they were really no longer for military use, but they were starting also push them for, commercial aviation. Everybody wanted to fly. And their most powerful of the engines would have been the H series, which cranked out about 300 horsepower. And again, typically these are all for biplanes. So there are a few monoplanes, and this is the Curtis Orenco D, as you can see. Now, this is 1920, 21. By 22, 23, they're starting to look at some air-cooled engines, and you see their advertisement of what they're producing. But you'll notice out of the 6 engines, 1, 2, 3, 4 of them are still their V engine, based on Hispana Suiza, which you see the nameplate here with the 300 horsepower. But they didn't really come up with too much with air-cooled at the time, because they really thought the way to stick was with the liquid-cooled engine. This is also the beginning of their more powerful engines with the Tornado, and this is where they start naming them after winds. You know what a tornado is, so this is just indicating how much power this engine can generate, and it did generate up to 600 to 700 horsepower depending on which model. And one of the planes that it was used in was one plane that actually Wright's was building. Wright's probably built less than 15 of their own aircraft. But, in the early 20s, they thought, we're going to build airplane engines. We're also going to build some planes. So you have the Navy Wright 1 racer here. And this was really built for the Navy. And what it was used for would have been for competing in the Pulitzer races. The Pulitzer Cup that you see on the left there were a series of races that were ran from 1920 to 1945. And they would draw crowds of like 100,000 people. I mean, coming back from World War I, and you were, the hotshot pilot, people couldn't get enough of them. They were like our heroes, our daredevils. So they were ready for exhibitions. And most of these really were focusing on the Army and Navy. This particular model made it through most of the race, and then unfortunately it wrecked. It actually, the engine overheated, which was one of the biggest problems in general with liquid cooled engines of the day. So it overheated and she crashed. But they weren't going to be outdone. What they did is they rebuilt it, the Navy. I mean, completely rebuilt it. It barely resembles the other plane. And then they made it a sesquiplane. Then instead of a biplane, it has the bottom wing is slightly smaller, but it was a seaplane. And what they're doing here, it was to compete in the Schneider Cup, which they would go to the Isle of Wight in England. Unfortunately, once again, it didn't overheat this time, but they had an accident, ended up in the in the drink, and they just let her, it got its burial at sea, and they stopped getting these involved in these races with, unfortunately, with our airplanes, for the few that were there. One of the last successful racers for the 1923 Pulitzer race would have been the F2W. Again, once again, powered by the Tornado, but the later version, the 3, which was the 700 horsepower. And these were really experimental aircraft, and also it was to get people interested in aviation in general, because they could see the need for not just for airmail but moving people, and this is where we were heading. One unique engine that they made, and there's only one in existence, and it's at the Smithsonian. Many of these pieces you'll find on my website are from the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum. They built this inline 6 for the dirigibles that the U.S. was starting to create in response to the Graf Zeppelins. It was particularly built for the first one, which was the U.S. Shenandoah. However, after testing it, they abandoned the engine, and Wright really didn't make their way, and it was really Packard engines that would power this beast. Of course, after a couple of years, this thing actually crashes and wrecks. So maybe Wright's is lucky that they didn't, get the blimp off the ground, so to speak. Whirlwinds, this is where the beginning of our air-cooled engines. This is what Wright's is really known for. Right? I mean, when you think about Wright's, there's only 2 engines that come to mind. It's Whirlwinds and Cyclones. Again, sticking with the Tornado, Whirlwinds. Now, the very first air-cooled engine that was successful was built by Charles Lawrence in New York, and he was building a 9-cylinder, started with the R1, and it became the model J1. And it was used by the Navy with their TR-1 seaplane, which was a racing plane. And you can see it did win the one race in the Curtiss Marine Cup. And what was most important about this was it was lighter, it was far more efficient, and of course it didn't overheat. It didn't really react so much to temperatures. Again, as the plane got higher and the air got thinner, you'd have to worry about freezing. The air-cooled engine was the way to go. This is the only shot I could find of the TR-1, which was just strictly for racing purposes. But it was enough that the Navy really wanted this. The Navy actually, because of this engine, canceled all of Wright's liquid-cooled engines and insisted they started building air-cooled engines. And I think Wright's at first was a little reluctant, but then it was the military that really forced them to merge with Curtiss. I mean, with Lawrence, and this would really be a big plus for them, of course. The one engine that was used with this J1 was for you see the USS Langley, the very first aircraft carrier in the United States Naval Fleet. And these are the planes that were used. And it's the TS1, same one, just not the racing piece. The one thing that's interesting about this plane, though, if you take a quick look at it, you notice it more on the one on the bottom. The fuselage is really suspended, where normally the bottom wing is, attached, and here it's really the fuselage is just floating between the two pieces, 2 wings. The J1 under Lawrence would be reworked and become the J2, but by the time he merged with Wright's in 23, they're going to start producing our very first air-cooled engine, which is the J3. It's very short-lived. I was able to find one example in the Curtiss Hall Light Pursuit plane. Again, these were used for training, although this was carrying 2 machine guns at the time in 1925. The J3 was really, the beginnings of Wright's involvement. And once the merger took place and our engineering crew started tearing into the engine, this was the beginning of the Whirlwind series. And the J4 would be the very first successful, at least commercially, for Wright's. Again, 9-cylinder air-cooled engine. This particular one you're going to hear about in a few minutes. This was the one that one of the 3 engines that Admiral Byrd would use to fly over the South Pole in 1926. One of the first manufacturers to adopt the J4 was the Fokker Universal. Fokker was originally in the Netherlands. Anton Fokker was more famous for designing aircraft for Germany during World War I. Opened a plant here prior to World War I, actually, in Passaic, and then later they would be based at Teterboro as the Atlantic Aircraft Corporation. Later they'd get taken over by North American. And this particular model they made, about 50% of them are really used in Canada. And you can see the Winnipeg on the western Canadian Airlines there. And then again, they got rid of the wheels for the frozen tundra or the water with pontoons or skis. Another piece that Fokker would make was their tri-motor, which was one of their larger for aviation, for commercial carrier, as well as for mail service. The group of gentlemen here, looking at one of their very first one, the gentleman on the left, second from the left, is our Secretary of the Commerce, Herbert Hoover, who would later be President of the United States. And right behind him, on his right, to the right of him, is Fokker, Anton Fokker. Later went by Anthony while he was here. Ford also made a tri-motor. This is the very first one, the Ford AT. These photos don't illustrate it as well, but it's an all aluminum body, and it's corrugated. It's not smooth to give it extra rigidity. It was an excellent plane. But historically speaking, the most important flight that was ever powered by a J4 would have been the 1926 Byrd expedition over the North Pole. On the left there, you see it's Richard Byrd and his co-pilot, or actually the pilot was Floyd Bennett. Byrd was the navigator on this particular expedition. And, I really don't do these justice because the Byrd expedition could be a whole talk in and of itself. The crew actually, it may have been those two gentlemen that flew the plane over to the North Pole, but actually the whole crew was about 50 people. After the plane was built and tested in Teterboro and in the area, it went to, from New York, and it had to be shipped to Spitsbergen, Norway, and then it was loaded onto a ship. I mean, when it was unloaded to the ship, they couldn't get it to the dock. So you can see here, it was loaded onto 4 raft boats, and she was disassembled several times. So this is really quite the feat. And then, and the biggest thing was the navigation because of, the magnetic poles. You couldn't use a standard compass, and he was using a sun compass. And it has been argued that maybe he didn't make it, but I think modern scholarship is giving back and giving him the favor that he did make it. I mean, it was about a 15-hour flight. He traveled about 1,300 miles, but he was able to leave and come back to the same spot in Norway, which you really can't appreciate by today. But just imagine the snow, the fog, and of course, there's no land bearings. It's just frozen ice beneath you. And once he got to where they assumed the North Pole was, they made a 4-mile loop around a few times before they went back. And they did this all in one day. And of course, that's, success definitely got him world fame, got his ticker tape parade. And Calvin Coolidge presented both Bennett. Bennett's receiving the medal right now, the Medal of Honor, Congressional Medal of Honor. And to the left on the already wearing his medal is Richard Byrd. Unfortunately for Floyd Bennett, his career would be cut short in 1928. He actually led a rescue mission to Canada. The Bremen flight at the bottom that you see there was the very first attempt to cross the Atlantic from going west to east. So they left from Ireland and landed in Canada on Greenlee Island. But when the plane landed, it hit a peat moss and it just got wrecked. The news was there. Other people were there to, witness this and come try and help him out, but they couldn't get the plane, back into the air. So he used a Ford tri-motor. Here you can see where it's the corrugated body surfaces that it would use. He flew this plane, and the plane still exists. Anyway, he had previously crashed and had contracted pneumonia, and he still had pneumonia while he was going to rescue the disabled airman, and his condition got worse, and, sadly, he passed away from the pneumonia in Canada. And this one on a high note for at least 1926, 25. Wrights did make one of the more successful engine, would have been with the partnership with Giuseppe Belanca to make the Wright Belanca. This is one of 2 that would be manufactured, and this one's powered by the J4. We always talk about Wright's engines, and you're always talking about speed, altitude, endurance. But this plane also added, and with the engine, is efficiency was really key too. Fuel conservation, that you can, you make sure you can reach your destination and have excess fuel on board as well. Sometimes they don't always get it right. This is the Wright Simoon. Simoon is actually like a hot desert wind. Think of, being out in like Egypt and the desert storm comes through. That's what a Simoon is. They produced this 1200, and it was an experimental model at first, low production. And what they attached it to initially was the Wright Apache. Again, another plane that we built. This was for the Navy. It became a pretty big test pilot For test pilots, this was one of their favorite planes. However, the engine was far from their favorite. And the one thing the Navy did was they deleted the engine rather quickly. You could see it here in two different versions. It's the same plane, but with the landing gear with wheels, as opposed to the giant pontoon. But they dumped it for the Pratt Whitney 1340. So Pratt Whitney, who was our main competitor, as well as they were founded by the former president of Wright's, sometimes made a more efficient engine. And in this case, they would keep the engine in the plane for another, they would test it about 1935. So, they had about a 7 to 9 year run using their engine, but it was our plane. The engine that really makes the biggest difference and really put Wrights on the map is the Wright Whirlwind J5. This is the one that's going to power Lindbergh and some of the most historic flights that ever took place. You see the three gods of aviation at the time. On the left is Charles Lindbergh. Center is Richard Byrd, and to his right, who's shaking hands, is Clarence Chamberlain. So these guys were making the news every other day, but nothing topped the feat that Lindbergh did when he flew from New York to Paris nonstop to claim the Artigue Prize, which they paid about $25,000. That's what this was all about. When he's taking off from Roosevelt Field, you see Lindbergh shaking the hands. Charles Lawrence was there to wish him well because it was his engine, and the whole reputation of Wright's Aeronautical really was riding on that flight. If they made it successful, this is going to open the world to them. If it was a failure, well, we'd have to see what happened, but they didn't have to worry about that because, from May 20th, 21st, 1927, he successfully, traversed the Atlantic. Parades were everywhere. Yes, he got his ticker tape parade. He didn't get the parade here in Paterson, unfortunately. We got bumped, but he did come later and would just meet with the employees of Wright's. He came twice that time after his historic flight, as long as the press wasn't involved, and he didn't want a big thing. He just wanted to thank the men who were responsible for saving him from, ending up in the Atlantic Ocean. Although you see right behind City Hall, we have a model of the J5 that was being touted throughout the city. Who really tried to get the record would have been Clarence Chamberlain and his co-pilot Levine. Unfortunately, they had some problems with their backers. They also had the Wright J5. They had the Wright Belanca. This is the second one, the WB2. If that would have made it, we would have had, a Paterson engine and a Paterson airplane would have been the first to cross. So actually, we're the second. I guess with the history frame, Levine is the very first passenger to cross the Atlantic in an airplane. So we just missed it by 43 days. But the biggest difference was he went to Germany. He was trying to get to Berlin. He was about 60 miles short when he ends up in Eisleben, where, after his, propeller cracked in half. So he had to cut it just a little short. But again, the heroes welcome. And again, the Wright plane, were well established, but Wright's did not concentrate any longer for airplane production and just concentrated on engine building. Other historic flights with Ben Iselson and Sir George Wilkins, they fly from Alaska over the North Pole and back into Norway, back to Spitsbergen, where the Chamberlain flight had begun, and in Lockheed Vega. Again, this is also another story. If anybody ever wants to hear a story or, a program based on these particular flights alone and what it took, let us know in the comments, or you could do a whole series of lectures just on one engine alone Wrights would build. The most famous aviator, or aviatrix, I should say, in the women class, of course, is Amelia Earhart. I think some of her fame, she was an outstanding pilot, but of course, I think it's sort of like the Titanic, the mystery of, what happened to her until, hopefully one day they'll discover the plane that she flew, which the last plane was not powered by a Wright's engine. So I'll just tell you that right now. But the Fokker that she used to the triple wing, just similar to the Chamberlain plane. She actually didn't fly this. It was really Stoltz and Gordon were the pilots, and she was really just a passenger. She was offered to fly, but she didn't. She gets the best credit because of her husband. Putman was in publishing, so she had her publicist all the time. Where other women had to really fight to get some press. It was man's world back then, And for the most part, they thought it was too dangerous for women to fly. And, especially if you're married and a mom, they did not want to see, somebody's wife get killed in a plane accident. And every time a woman would start going, further and further, would normally be an aviator got killed, and that would break up some of her backing from time to time. My favorite flyer of the period is Eleanor Smith. She actually received her license at 16 years old. She was at the time the youngest pilot in the United States. She started flying when she was about 6, and her father got her a plane. She was flying the family crop duster at 10. Which she's her real claim to fame. Now, she did air endurance records. Her altitude record, there was a hole in the oxygen and she passed out, but came through as the plane was in a nosedive. I mean, a real heroine and an exciting career. But the one thing that she did that really put her on the map was flying under the 4 bridges under the East River. No one has ever attempted that before because it's quite illegal. So even when she did it, they ready to zap her pilot license, but before the Commerce Department could get involved, Mayor Jimmy Walker stepped in and gave her a 10-day suspension. But she was like the doll of aviation. And she did everything that Amelia Earhart did, but I think better. And actually, in 1930, women pilots voted her as the greatest pilot of the era. And Amelia Earhart was one of the people who voted for her. Her first endurance record is 26 hours. And some of these endurance, I just remember filling up the tank of gas and not stopping. That's in 1929. She would also participate in the very first plane-to-plane mid-air fueling. And again, there's a lot to talk about her, not all with the Wright's engines. Here you can see she's in, again, a Blanca, except this Blanca was made in Delaware, but it's the same design that we were building here in Paterson, and it has a little bit later engine, the J6. Her other one claim to fame, though, that still exists, is she was the first woman to be covered on the box of Wheaties back in 1934. So she was really well known, but at the same time, she was also promoting aviation, and she was very involved politically in, passing laws and making, women more involved when, she fell in love and married a lawyer and a New York State legislator who eventually, forced her, I would say at first to give up flying when she became, a mom, and she would have 4 children. And then back, another 20 years would pass. She would start flying again up until, she even participated in her 80s in the space shuttle flight simulators. And she did have a long life. She made it to 98. I'm sorry I never met her. Talking about mid-air and the beginning of these records, mid-air refueling made it possible. Again, here's a J5 and an American Fokker aircraft. And you can see it just traveled 150 hours. This is in Los Angeles. These are what they would call closed circuit. It's not going from point to point. It's just traveling in a wide, circling around the airfield in case anything does go wrong. But, several times a day, they would have to send food down to them as well as fuel to keep it going until something finally gives. And then, the plane's got to come down. About a year later, so in 1929, Admiral Byrd is going to be back at it once again, except this time he's using a Ford tri-motor with the J6 engines in it and the Byrd Antarctic. So he's the first to fly over the South Pole. So he holds the distinction North and South Poles. And the plane at this time, you could barely make it on the bond. It was named in honor of his former pilot friend, Floyd Bennett. Although you can see the film and there is footage on YouTube. I recommend you watch it. You can see some of the historic flights it was covered at this time. And the big improvement, they made about 14,000 J5s before we started getting into the J6. And the J6 series were several engines, was the 5, 7, and 9-cylinder engines for various applications. Here's Wright's J5, 540 cubic inches displacement, and it has 160 horsepower. Several manufacturers from Fairchild, American Eagle Aircraft. It's still basically flying the biplanes of the day. Very durable engine. So nothing, reliable and inexpensive, lightweight, which was very important. One of the few records was set with this is a real endurance record. Remember the first refueling was 150 hours. Well, the Flying Key brothers, this gentleman left and right, we have Fred and Al Key. They do a tremendous flight over Meridian, Mississippi of 653 hours. They're almost up there for a month. And here's a picture of Al on the catwalk, because the engines did require some maintenance lubrication, and they developed a catwalk, a pipe system there where he'd have to get out periodically and do some maintenance. At first, I was looking at these pipes and I'm thinking, why didn't they put like some kind of platform? But of course, a platform would have added extra, drag and would have presented another wing on there. So you got to balance yourself midair, oil. There's a prop standing in front of you, spinning away. I mean, how exciting. And the plane is preserved at the Smithsonian. I'm not sure if it's on display right now. Again, it was a Curtis Robin J in Ole Miss. And the way they have it displayed, as you can see, they have the, a figurine of Al doing the oiling. Another guy who got a lot of credit. Some of the kids today, when I mention this, they don't know him, but Wrong Way Corrigan. He was excited about Lindbergh's historic flight, and he wanted to replicate it. Actually, he was working at the Ryan Airplane Corporation that built the Spirit of St. Louis, and he had there's pictures of him putting the wings on, but he also worked on the instrument panel at the time. And he was a great aviator, but he could never get permission to fly from New York to Ireland. And he thought, okay, no problem. Yeah, I'll just abandon it. And actually, the engine he used was from 1929, and he had two of these engines, and he pieced it together. And he had an older Balanca, and the FAA of the day looked at it as like, this would never make it. They would not certify him to go. But then they did let him go back to California. And he left. He said it was so foggy that he went the wrong way, wink, wink. But he did make it all the way to Dublin, which was amazing. As I mentioned, he was working on the Lindbergh engine. He was quite the aviator, even though, he really went, 180 in the wrong way by accident. Again, got his ticker tape parade, became an instant celebrity. I mean, he was, you could see he has like that infectious smile. He's a real gem of a guy. Nobody could be mad at him. I mean, they sure got a little talking as the bad boy of aviation, but, he did just all right, just as his engine did. Wright's further development, 225 horsepower, and this is going to be the Whirlwind 7. The fledgling actually is a Navy training. This was built by Curtis as well. Yeah, most of our biplanes and planes you're going to find were Navy trainers because we're in between wars. And they are hoping to sell some of these for, commercial aviation, for pilots. This is definitely a rich man's toy. This Waco is pretty interesting. Notice the tail numbers, NC666N. Here it is in race form, same plane. Let's just go back and forth. This is how the normal trim was, and they try to make it a little bit more aerodynamic for racing, and put the extra strut that suspends the two wings, and there's a cowling over the engine. The cowling actually has two jobs. One, it does redirect the air smoother, but it also advances the cooling on the air-cooled cylinders. Some other famous aviators, Francis and Louise Staden. We met earlier. She had done the one distance record. I.A. Fox, he was a furrier in New York, and he thought this was a real great campaign. He financed for them to get the Curtiss Thrush and to set another endurance record of 196 hours. Again, we go back to that 115. They were just, really short of the men's record. Once again, air to air. It's hard to imagine how they were doing that today, matching speeds and everything. I mean, and there was still once in a while maintenance. You may have to go outside the plane. Fortunately, the J6 was a lot more reliable. Frances would actually go on to several other feats before, unfortunately, she would pass away in a Air Force in an airplane wreck. Outdoor girl, again, 237. So this was the thing. They're getting on the news. Naval Aircraft Factory, they liked, using our engines and building Curtiss and buying them, but they also had licensing agreements. They were based in Philadelphia, so they were building our version of the J6 just to keep costs down, and they could control, and if they wanted to do any extra experimenting on it, as well as they were building the same planes. This is all through licensing agreement. Their largest of the J6 would be the 975, which could crank out 300 horsepower. Again, 300 horsepower, much lighter, cooler, more efficient than the Tornado, which was also, or rather the H series that was doing 300. Fokker plane, this is at Teterboro and the Wright's hangar. All our planes were tested right here at Teterboro. They really were trying to push for an airport closer to Paterson, but unfortunately that never happened. One of the longest flights without stopping or refueling was by Russell Boardman and John Polano, as you can see here. Again, they had a special Wright Belanca, and they were using the J6, and they traveled over 5,000 miles nonstop. That's the very first recorded flight of that. Actually, 5,011 from Long Island, where they left, to Istanbul. Other planes that would use this would be the Lockheed Electra. I like the one for the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard plane was interesting. That's why I have the Department of the Treasury, because that would be the plane that the Secretary of the Treasury back in 43 would use if he had to travel, across the country. There's only a couple of these planes still left with the original Wright's engine. Other military planes for observation and training, the North American BT-9. Yeah, just some of the variations. And you can see from the color shot that, this plane is still around. So you can, it's nice to see some of these old planes, in service. I think Wrights didn't learn with the D1. So they tried one more time, this time with a blip as opposed to a dirigible. And they had put their 975 in the K1 and K2. Unfortunately, with the Wright propeller, it was just too loud and it just made too much noise. And they solved it by putting another Pratt Whitney in. So that didn't go too far. One other interesting application of the engine was it was also used in tanks. For the Sherman and the Lee, the M3, it was powered by this. You see, this is one of the early tanks. On the left is the British, and the right is the American version. The American version had a slightly higher turret. And they were producing these tanks as a stopgap when they needed them right away for World War II. As you know, it doesn't really have a functioning turret. The main cannon actually only swivels there on the right-hand side of the vessel. But it is an air-cooled engine. And the way it worked, as opposed to putting off the shaft, having a propeller attached to it, they had fan blades that would rotate, and that would provide the air cooling for the engine. Here's a whole series of them by the Chrysler Corporation where they're building some of these engines in wiring harness. And you can see an engine being dropped into the back of a tank. And also that same shaft that would run the fan, it would also be attached later to the drive shaft. Later tank, the M4, which was more successful for World War II, that also commanded a Wright's J975. Here in 1944 in France, they're doing a swapping out. The engine blew, whatever had a problem. And you see on the bottom there, they're putting a brand new engine in. It took about 90 minutes to get this tank back up and running. That's how quick you could, do a field dressing. Better version of what the tank looked like. Again, the airplane engine is hidden by that cowling and the fans, but without that, of course, the engine just would have overheated. And the last tank to use that would have been the M18 Hellcat, tank destroyer. One little engine that they made, and this was really more for European use, would have been the Wright Gypsy. The Wright Gypsy weighs about 100 pounds and it made about 100 horsepower. Ideally, it doesn't have the best setup. As you can see, where the propeller shaft is, it's quite low, and the cylinder heads are pretty high up. And you look at the de Havilland Gypsy Moth there, you see just above the right side, there's this giant cowling that, they would use to help cool the air. And actually, it did block some of the pilot's vision. So I don't know what they were really talking about. There's quite a few of these still going. Actually, the Amy, the yellow-black one there, went up for sale not too long ago because that was used in the movie Out of Africa. But it is de Havilland Gypsy Moth. But you do see on, how the right side of the plane does get a little blockage. This one little shot that I took, again, I do a lot of research through Library of Congress. And when I was researching whirlwinds, this one image came up, and I'm pretty sure the older gentleman who's instructing the young aviators here is John Green, who was a pilot, and he was part running the Columbian Air Center in Maryland. This is one of the few airports that would allow black flyers. Yeah, and they also had, an aviation school, and here they are just looking at there. So I threw this in because it's the Whirlwind, but they were a lot nicer than, some of the other places around because they would allow white pilots to fly. They did stress that. There is a marker on the land. I mean, the field is long gone. Thank God we don't have that segregation anymore. But, it was a different world than we know today. The very first Cyclone, it was based on a 9-cylinder engine. Again, now we can crank out about 525 horsepower. And again, 1750 refers to the size of, if you add up the volume of the cubic inches inside the cylinders. The one big plane that was taken, I mean, big plane, was the Keystone Patrician. This is the K-78. Right, there were only 3 of them ever built. The one on the bottom is actually for Wrights, and another one was built for Trans World Airlines. The Wrights Corporation actually bought it as an executive fleet, and it cost about $100,000. This plane, the plane was so massive. Again, you really don't get the scale, but in one of their flights, when they were demonstrating it, the initial one, they had 33 women passengers on board. To give you an idea of how many people could fit in this behemoth. Unfortunately, this is right before the war, and the larger planes that they were really starting to promote for commercial aviation is going to be lost because of the war effort. Their most prominent engine, I think highest production, would be the R1820. Now, when I say the R1820, I'm using just this one version of it. There are about 8 or 9 different versions of most of these engines, as they were constantly improving. So you would have like the R1800, then you would have the G100, the G200. There was a whole series of them with, so they continued to improve their engines to give them more horsepower. They'd go anywhere from 1200 to about 1700 horsepower. One of the first pilots to use this once again was Lindbergh. This is his Lockheed Sirius plane that he flew, and they had a special version of it that it cranked 710. So this is the earliest day of the 1820. And really what he was doing with his wife, Anne, is they flew 29,000 miles, and you can see how they flew around from South America, up to Greenland, Europe, Africa. And really what they were mapping out was the most efficient airline future routes. That was the mission. And you can see that plane again also at the Smithsonian. Some of the other planes that it would be attached to, this was the Curtiss Raven. This is actually an observatory use only. They didn't really like it, the military, so much. Even though you'd look out either side, it wasn't the most efficient as an observation plane, and it would be used up to the war. We really got news with Howard Hughes, Hughes aircraft, and he's going to fly his Lockheed. He's the first one to fly around the world, we'd say, but it's the northern hemisphere, so it's not the greatest distance as if you were flying around the equator. If you look at the nose art, some of his sponsorship was also helped to promote the 1939 World's Fair. So, again, big engine that was done. And then the beginning of some of the military uses, the Lockheed Constellation. Actually, this is a light bomber as well as cargo plane. And then one of the 2 versions of the Hell Diver. This is a dive bombing plane. Again, all using the same 1820. The main engine, when we think about the 1820, however, is really for the B-17 bomber program, which was the main plane used in the European theaters. And it was a pretty indestructible plane. The Memphis Belle gets a lot of notoriety, but one of the first planes to complete 40 missions, and I think they may have just been ahead of the Memphis Belle, but again, you got to have the right publicity, would have been Hell's Angels. And then Hell's Angels came back to the United States and did a major tour, trying to raise money for war bonds and all. And of course, they made a stop at Paterson, where they interviewed the crew, and they got to see the plane. The plane was actually in Teterboro at the time, didn't make it all the way to Paterson. We didn't give up on tanks, though. The 1820 was used in a very heavy tank, but it was only experimental and was never used for any military applications. And the rest of our engines are just going to be for aviation. Getting a little bit more powerful. They're starting to build twin Cyclones. They're almost 2 engines together. This is a 14-cylinder, so there's 7 cylinders in front, and in between you have another 7 cylinders. And here's the Paterson plant. You see the assembly line production of manufacturing these, which had an average of 1,600. Now, we had successfully crossed the Atlantic and the Pacific several times with Wright engines, and this was really on the radar, of course, of international travel. And Boeing had, developed this Clipper class, and you can see it's several layers. It was like the lap of luxury, because they were really gearing up for traveling to Europe, traveling out to Hawaii, and they were all set. And then of course the war came out. I got that little reference there so I wouldn't forget. FDR, 1943. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the very first sitting president, to actually travel by air. And he went to a conference from Miami to Casablanca, and he made several stops along the way, Tripoli and all, but the first president to fly, and it was done in a Boeing Clipper. The biggest notoriety for the 2600 or the 14-cylinder engine would have been for the Doolittle raids. This was the very first time that, we showed the Axis powers that, the United States is a formidable power. What they did to us at Pearl Harbor, we came back in Tokyo. Successful? No. Successful in boosting morale? Yes. That's, more what it really did for us. But the Doolittle raids are a real magnificent piece of aviation history. And where it all started, which you found out later if you were reading like the Paterson Evening News during the war, is that actually the first conversations between the military and Wright's engineers took place at the Alexander Hamilton Hotel to see if this was even feasible. Would this engine be able to be launched off a carrier, make it to Tokyo and back? Unfortunately, they got spotted early, so they left earlier. They made it to Tokyo, but most of them did not make it back. And that's a whole story of itself. You mentioned the first Curtiss Helldiver, a little later version of it. Again, another dive bomber using our particular engine. And then the Curtiss-Wright was supposed to continue building planes, the CW. This really was going to compete with the DC-4, or at least that's what they thought they were planning. I mean, this is a monster Airstream plane. It had two different tail sections. You can see it has the twin tail on the upper image and the standard one in the back. However, it would be pretty quickly converted for military applications. It really ended up as the Curtiss Commando, which was just essentially cargo transport for our military use. Wright's largest and most powerful engine would be the R3350. Very similar to the 2600 14-cylinder. Now we got 18 cylinders. This could crank out a maximum of 2,200 horsepower. Actually, later versions of it, which would later be turbocharged after the war, could crank out up to 4,000 horsepower. Very complex engine. This really does look like two engines put together. This engine alone weighed almost 3,000 pounds. And the planes that normally use this required up to 4 of them. Particularly for commercial aviation would have been the Lockheed Constellation. For commercial airlines, as well as for troop transport. I like that. Once in a while, again, beauty of the internet, I found a schematic to give you an idea of the construction of the plane. You know what the engines look like. And of course, its main purpose during World War II was for the B-29 bomber program. This was so important that Wright's had a separate plant built. That's where when they would eventually relocate to Woodridge. Production on all the other engines stopped after the European theater was winding up, and to finish the war in the Pacific, they just concentrated solely on building for the the R3350. So, over the course of Wright's, they predicted in 1926, they said the sun never sets on Wright's engines. And they really were right, all the way up through the war years and beyond. So Wright's really did make the world smaller. That covers it.
Well, Jack, that was a great presentation. Thank you so much. And now if anybody has any questions about anything that they just heard or some aviators that they didn't hear about, maybe, please feel free to put those questions in the chat for us.
This is the first time I've done concentrating on just the engines. Normally, I only highlight 1 or 2 of these in the overall presentation. And there's a lot more. As I said, you can make a presentation just about the 1820 or just one of like Chamberlain's flights. So,
did you really struggle with how to sort of tailor the program, and did you have to leave people out that you didn't want to leave out, or?
Yeah, part of the problem, you find some of the historic flights, and you got to keep researching it to find out what was the airplane engine. It sort of goes back to like Charles Lawrence said when he finally was recognized. He received the Collier Award from President Calvin Coolidge for his work in developing the J5, and he said, nobody remembers Paul Revere's horse's name, and sometimes the engine at a plane is really the horse. The Lockheed Electra, the Constellation. Well, what was the engine? What was the engine? Although, during the war years, it's also sometimes you really got to pay attention to which model plane, because Pratt Whitney, yeah, they were our number one competitor, but during the war, we all worked together. So under licensing agreements, they were making some of Paterson engines. Chicago, the Chrysler Corporation. The Chrysler Corporation actually made more R3350s than we did here in Paterson. The best was I mentioned the real quick the tanks with the R975. Actually, we have one on display at the museum, R975. They were built mostly by Continental in Cincinnati, again through Wright's licensing agreement. Of the total production is roughly around 60,000, which is pretty substantial. Only 7,000 were made in Paterson. Most of them were made by Continental. 53,000 plus.
We do have some questions rolling in here, Jack, so I'm just going to start reading them out to you and you can answer them. Did Wright's merge with Curtiss after World War II, during, or before?
1929 was the merger.
And what kind of security precautions were taken in Paterson to protect aircraft engine plants and other plants in Paterson? Other war plants during World War II.
Actually, employment was strict. Everybody, of course, had their ID. You had to be a U.S. citizen. If you weren't a U.S. citizen, they would even look at you to try and get employment. And during the war years, they had lost about 15,000 men. As soon as they would train you, normally your draft number came up and off you'd have to go. Oh, again, we did have our Rosie the Riveters, filling in for their husbands. But so you had security everywhere. And they were definitely don't talk. It's the promotions don't talk about how much you've done production wise. So they had a gag order on the employees, even amongst themselves. They shouldn't be talking other than what you needed for. Don't say, well, today, we polished up, 5,000 cylinders. As for safety, there were some gun mounts that were mounted, cannons up on Garrett Mountain, because they always figured if the United States was going to be hit, the Wright's plant would definitely be one of the first ones that they would try to take out.
So one other question, is it known what engine or engines were being built at the Woodridge plant, and what aircraft from the war would have used those engines?
The main engine for the government built the Woodridge plant. Wright's was originally leasing it, and it was for the R3350. It was really for the B-29 bomber program. Although there were several other planes that used it. I don't have the whole list of them, but I can get that to you. But the main production was for the bomber because they wanted to end the war. And unfortunately for Wright's, the war ended a lot sooner, and then they had to lay everybody off, for 2 weeks, shut down, because they thought they were going to have orders through 47. And I believe the government paid them about $80 million for all the parts, because it was so extensive. In Paterson, we stopped building the 1820, but we were building parts for the engine. So, we were, the 5 plants in and around Paterson were also building for the 3350, but all assembly was taking place at Woodridge. And then eventually all of Wright's would move there.
So Ashley just said to thank you for including the African Americans in your presentation. Mike was wondering, did a Wright's engine power the Enola Gay?
Yes, it is an R3350. It was not a Paterson or Woodridge built. That would have been a Chicago built. Chrysler Corporation got involved, and it was the Dodge plant that solved a lot of the cooling issues. The plane engine really starts around 1939 or so, but they really don't have much to use it in. It was used for the World's Fair. They were showing it. Here's our largest powerful engine, but it wasn't really to like 42, 43 when it's like, oh my God, we need this in high production. And they had cooling issues, oil leaking, and the the Chrysler Corporation figured it out. And under licensing agreement, they built about 18,500 of our engines. And that's what you would have found in both the Enola Gay and the other dropped the bomb in Nagasaki.
So Jim says, thank you very much for taking the time to put this together and present it for us. And then we have a question, or kind of a comment. Someone is saying, an airport near Paterson may have made a difference in the history of the city. Any idea why it could not be built?
Even if it would have been built, it wouldn't have lasted long. You look at runways are today, there were a lot of little airports. Again, you only needed a field in the early days. So in the 20s, they weren't thinking like Newark International type dealer. So they got stuck with Teterboro. Paterson's biggest problem, though, is also it's only 8.4 square miles. we don't really have much available land. At the time, they could have built an airport rather for like the biplanes and all, but once the larger aircraft, it wouldn't have made it here anyway. I think they were right on that.
Another great webinar, says Mark. Thank you, Jack. I'd be interested in any talk you would give.
Too kind.
And Chuck wants to know, were there any sabotage events at any of the Jersey plants?
No, not that I recall. Thanks to newspapers.com, I can look it up again though. As I said, they were pretty severe. If they, questioned your background or anything, they would yank you. The police department worked very close. The police trained, they had a large police force of Wright Aeronautical. They had their own ambulance. I mean, they were pretty self-contained little world.
And Jim's wondering what years was the Paterson plant in operation?
Paterson plant was in operation from 1920 to 1946.
Dennis says another great presentation.
Yeah, Dennis caught me. I don't use notes, so I will be honest. And when you're talking, I may make a mistake every now and then. I got it written, but I really couldn't read it at the time, so I don't bother with notes. So I apologize for any mistakes I may have made.
And Karen just says, thank you for continuation of part 1, that she has truly gained a lot and appreciates your webinar.
Part 3 is going to be tough. I'm just started working on that, covering the personnel, the people, the union, who are the leaders. They had a lot of strikes. Everybody worked together during World War II, but I think they also knew the iron was hot. If we have a problem, now's the time to strike. You could walk out for a couple of days. That would bring everybody to the bargaining table real quick.
Right. Now, just to remind everybody, what Jack is talking about is part 3 of this 3-part series, which is the right way Wright's employees at work and play. We are going to be presenting that on Tuesday, June 3rd at 2 o'clock. So if you are interested, I will be sending out a sign up for you to register for that as that program gets closer. Before June, if you're desperately missing Jack's face and my own, you can see us again on May 13th. That program, however, is not going to be about rights. That's going to be the first of a 5-part series that we are doing about the 100 artifacts for 100 years that we presented for the 100th anniversary of the museum. So if you're interested in that program, both of those, if you signed up for this, you should be receiving our emails to notify you of those programs and give you the link where you can pre-register. And we hope that you'll join us. And if you ever miss one, or people who are interested, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, the programs that we present here on Zoom are recorded, and then we try to get them up on the YouTube channel for the museum, which is the Paterson Museum. Pretty timely. We try to get them up within a week or so, and we will then again send out an email to that same email list and let you know that the link is live and that it's it's up on Zoom, or sorry, rather up on YouTube if you want to watch it again or share it with somebody. And we do share that information as well on our social media. So either if you follow us on social media or you want to subscribe to us as a YouTube channel, either way, you'll find out when we've posted something up.
So June 3rd is Mike's birthday. What a great way to celebrate a birthday.
All right. Well, I think that we don't have any more questions, so I'm going to say that that's probably it for today. Thank you again, Jack, for this great second installment. And now the pressure's on to make part 3 even better.
Piece of cake.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. We really appreciate it. And hopefully you'll come and visit us at the museum soon.
And again, don't forget, if you have any ideas on some theme you'd like to cover in Paterson history, no matter how obscure, Heather and myself would be glad to take that challenge on.
Yep. So just send us an email and say we'd like a webinar on this, and we'll see what we can do. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good afternoon.